There are a lot of downsides to the legislation that's being proposed. When you require an online platform to pay news organizations every time their link is shared on their platform, you are incentivizing a behavior where these news organizations want to develop the most viral link that can go on social media. But that viral news, often that's not the local fact-based journalism that we're trying to incentivize. The links that are shared the most are often right-wing outrage content. So one of the concerns that we're raising is this is going to be a huge source of funds for Fox News, which just had to pay some $750 million for spreading election disinformation.
Hello and welcome again to another episode of Sacktown Talks. Today we're glad to be joined by Chris MacKenzie, Communications Director for the Chamber of Progress. Chris, how's it going and welcome to the program.
It's going well. Thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, thanks for coming on and discussing some of these interesting topics that's kind of hitting the legislature today. Can you kind of tell our listeners what you're doing and kind of about your organization?
Sure. Our organization is a center-left tech policy organization. We work on a range of tech policies, from content moderation to autonomous vehicles to cryptocurrency. But what we're going to be talking about today, I think, is the California Journalism Preservation Act, the CJPA, a bill that would require tech platforms to pay news outlets whenever a link is shared on that platform. So if you share a link with a friend on Facebook, linking to the New York Times or Fox News, Facebook would be required to pay those outlets when their link is shared.
Wow. I guess before we kind of dive into that, can you tell us a little more about the Chamber of Progress and kind of how it got started?
Yeah, sure. We're a 2-year-old tech industry group, so pretty new. And our focus is highlighting a progressive a path forward for, again, left-leaning lawmakers who are interested in promoting a tech-friendly future where we can adopt some of these tech innovations and look at how they can increase equality and increase progress in our society. So a great example is autonomous vehicles, right? Where we see autonomous vehicles as providing a path forward toward reducing roadway fatalities by decreasing human error behind the wheel, which is one of the main causes of roadway fatalities currently. So we support policies to adopt autonomous vehicles on our roads and see a future where that's actually going to really increase roadway safety.
Right. Yeah. It's got a lot of interesting stuff coming up with artificial intelligence and kind of, the world's changing fast. So I guess you guys are
I can spend a whole hour talking about AI. So don't get me started.
And how'd you get involved with the Chamber of Progress?
Sure. I've worked for a number of Democratic lawmakers in purple districts, right? So areas like Oklahoma, Alabama, Western Maryland, where you have a real mix of Republican and Democratic voters who are interested in, again, sort of a center-left approach to policy that values equality, values justice, but also values the contributions that industry makes to jobs and innovation in those communities. So after working on my most recent campaign, Chamber of Progress was just beginning, and I took the opportunity to join because I think there's a real vacuum on the left for industry-friendly voices to contribute towards a progressive policy vision. On the right, you have a lot of industry groups, Chamber of Commerce, for example,
right,
that have classically contributed to that party's policy platforms, right? But on the left, you don't have quite the same infrastructure. So being able to participate in an organization that wanted to build out what that vision would look like for Democratic lawmakers was an exciting chance.
Oh, that's interesting. So this is a national organization then?
We are, yeah. And we advocate on policies in all 50 states. California is extremely active on tech policy, as I'm sure you're aware.
Right.
So we spend a fair amount of time talking about what's happening in Sacramento. But we've been active this year on legislation in Utah, in Texas, Maryland, all over the country, as well as Congress.
Yeah, it's interesting because especially a lot of technology is based here, coming out of Silicon Valley, and it's been very interesting in the last couple of years seeing a bunch of these tech folk kind of moving out of state or working remotely, and kind of seeing how their attitudes and politics are shifting. It's kind of interesting. You described it as a kind of a left leaning organization, kind of helping progressive lawmakers kind of embrace technology. But a lot of this stuff gets kind of lost in politics, and whether right or left, it kind of makes its way hard to navigate. Kind of, how do you guys deal with that?
You don't have to tell me. I worked in politics for a decade. And so I know that politics oftentimes is really focused on the big picture and the story that lawmakers are able to tell their constituents about the work that they're doing, right? When in fact, good policy is often rooted in the nuance. And that's where our organization does a lot of its work, in the nuance. What are the specific impacts of a bill going to be if it passes? We're talking again today about this journalism legislation. And the big picture is that journalism across the country is struggling in the digital era. And these lawmakers, I understand their intentions. They're good intentions. They want to support journalism in the digital age by requiring platforms to pay these news outlets. But what are the unintended consequences? What are the impacts of that legislation actually going to be? That's where a lot of our work as an organization is focused, is highlighting for lawmakers who are now looking at this legislation, what are the actual impacts?
Right. It's kind of interesting is like technology happens and it might not necessarily be legal. Like we all remember when we were younger and we started downloading songs on Napster,
LimeWire.
LimeWire, and just getting free music and how great it was. And then people started getting in trouble, and then all of a sudden we started paying for music, and the free revolution. When Uber came in, everyone was like, "This is great." Why didn't we have this? And then you had the cabbies, and you had the whole labor argument going, and then we had AB5 here in California, and different things about questioning this whole gig economy. So it's fascinating always seeing this struggle, going back and forth of established laws and kind of workers' rights and things like that, and technology and how it changes the world.
Yeah, the United States has been slow in a lot of ways to react to the explosive growth of the tech industry with policies that are going to protect consumers. California is an exception to that. California is often out in front of the rest of the nation, but certainly nationally, lawmakers have struggled to keep up with the industry as it innovates.
Right.
And the next frontier, as you mentioned, is AI, where we've already seen that similar kind of explosive growth in that industry. And lawmakers are looking at ways, how can we make sure this is safe for consumers? How can we make sure it isn't, infringing on the copyright on artists online? And it's going to be a challenge for lawmakers to keep up with that next frontier of technology as we see that innovation continue.
Yeah. So it's kind of interesting kind of talking about this AB 886 and kind of talking about journalism, because, this was like the first frontier of technology kind of taking over things. I remember talking with a gentleman named R.E. Grasswich, who worked for the local paper here, the Sacramento Bee, and he left and he started working in politics. And I asked him, why did you leave the paper? Because he was like a sports writer. He was well known. And he said, Craigslist. He said, I saw Craigslist come in the late 90s, early 2000s, and our, a majority of our revenue came from classifieds ads. And anyone who used to look at the paper knows that, classified ads, people would pay to put stuff for sale or of interest. And that totally went away. That totally wiped out a major revenue source from any paper. So that was just kind of like the first brick. And, 23 years later, here we are as news, has evolved and the internet's evolved and people are relying less and less on print media. So this is kind of, maybe 20 years too late, but it's an interesting thing that, they're trying to look at.
I think it's never too late to save journalism. And again, I think that the intention behind the legislation that we're talking about today is a good one. I think we should be working to support especially local news outlets that are really bearing the brunt of this struggle, right? But I think we have to consider what are the consumer impacts. If we were, again, to have acted on something like Craigslist back in the day when news organizations saw their revenue going there, consumers valued that as a tool, as a website for connecting and buying used items online. And so when you propose legislation, again, that's going to shift revenue from online platforms that consumers like and consumers enjoy toward news publishers, you have to think about who's getting the money, who's paying the money, and what kind of corporate behavior is this going to end up incentivizing.
Right. So, can you kind of help us dig into this AB 886 for us right now and kind of give us a little background and kind of, what the bill does?
Sure. I think as background, the first thing to say is that last year, Congress proposed similar legislation at the federal level called the JCPA. So same letter, same letters, different acronym, but it would basically do the same thing. It would require, again, online platforms to pay news publishers whenever their content is shared on that platform. So if I share a link to a Sacramento Bee article with my friend on Facebook, Facebook has to pay the Sacramento Bee for that link share, right? Now, California this year proposed similar legislation at the state level. It would require online platforms to negotiate with all of these news publishers and come to an agreement on how they're going to pay those news publishers for content that's shared on their platform. And the big platforms we're talking about here, again, are social media platforms like Facebook, as well as platforms like, Google News, Apple News, basically anywhere you turn to online where those links can be shared and spread around. The news publishers in this case make the argument that these online platforms are taking their content, even if it's just a snippet, even if it's just a headline and a thumbnail, and not paying for that content, right? But the online platforms make the point that these link shares are actually directing users to those news sites. When I share a link with my friend on Facebook, I hope they click it, right? And if they do, they end up going through to that local news site. And if it's the Sacramento Bee then has advertisements on their site where they make money from that web traffic. So it's not without benefit to these local news organizations and national news organizations to have their content shared on these online platforms.
As a consumer of links and getting news on places like Google News or Twitter, everyone will constantly just figure out immediately that once you click a link, you hit a paywall often. And so that seems to be the missing part of this whole conversation is, you hit paywalls every time you hit a link. So how does that deal with that?
Well, I mean, there's a reason I'm a subscriber to the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Sacramento Bee, the San Francisco Chronicle. It's because I kept hitting those paywalls, right? And again, that to me says something about the revenue that is regularly generated for all of these online outlets when there's traffic driven into their paywall. People are going to have to subscribe to those outlets in order to read the full article. So that's what the benefit is that these or news organizations see from what I would call the status quo, right? There are a lot of downsides to the legislation that's being proposed. Specifically, when you require an online platform to pay news organizations every time their link is shared on their platform, you are incentivizing a behavior where these news organizations want to develop basically the most viral link that can go on social media. You want as many shares as possible because at the end of the day, that's going to translate to a bigger paycheck from Facebook, right? But that viral news, the news that spreads fastest online, often that's not the local fact-based journalism that we're actually trying to incentivize. We actually know from internal research at online internet platforms that the links that are shared the most are often right-wing outrage content, right? So think more Tucker Carlson Fox News than your local Sacramento Bee article. That's what's getting the most shares. And so one of the concerns that we're raising with the CJPA is that effectively this is going to be a huge source of funds for Fox News, which just had to pay some $750 million for spreading election disinformation.
Right.
And so the Democratic lawmakers really want to pass a bill that's going to create a slush fund for a disinformation giant.
And that's kind of the most interesting part of this is you're right. Most of the news you see is shared via link on Twitter or Facebook, and people click it, and it creates a vacuum, right? It creates this, world where you don't know what's accurate or what's not, because, you get a link about this or that. I think the most famous thing right now is vaccines, right? And, what's the real story? What's the fake story? And you're right. If you create a vacuum where people can't share accurate news stories and we're just flooded with these kind of, fake news stories, then, how do people know what's real and what's not?
And most of all, if you create an incentive for these news organizations to produce media that's going to spread quickly online, again, you aren't incentivizing the type of journalism that we really value and that's really missing in the country, right? You are incentivizing clickbait effectively. And this is a concern that was brought up in the California Assembly when the bill was brought to the floor for debate. A couple of lawmakers came to the floor and raised the concern. I'm worried that this is going to incentivize disinformation over real news. So we actually published a study as an organization taking a look at who would make the most money from the CJPA. And our conclusion was that disinformation giants like Fox News would make something like 7-1, over what California news organizations would make, even collectively. It beat, the Sacramento Bee, it beat the LA Times by miles, right? Because those links from Fox News are shared so much more often on Facebook than a link from the LA Times.
Right. And it's interesting. This probably, something that they kind of want to balance out, right? They want to ensure that, everything is shared, equally, and accurate information is getting out. So they're actually creating a disincentive for their articles to be shared.
Well, the interesting thing about this whole debate is that it's very solvable for California lawmakers to address this issue, right? Because the fundamental, at the core of the bill, what lawmakers are trying to do is to support local news outlets to make sure that these struggling local papers, your Desert Sun, are going to have the funds needed to keep staff on and keep the lights on and keep the doors open. So if you want to do that, if that's your focus, the solution is to create a cap of the size of a news organization that can actually receive funding under the bill, which is what they did with the national version of this legislation, the JCPA, in Congress. But there's no cap in the California legislation. There's no requirement that the news organizations be based in California. So it is a little bit lopsided towards some of those national outlets that have the most shares online.
Yeah, and kind of we were seeing this in the news even today. Like, you're seeing Facebook talking about removing news from its platform, which, as you said, is a major way people share news. So yeah, that's a big deal.
Interesting thing about that, I see a lot of articles that discuss Facebook removing news from whether it's Canada or talking about removing news in California if this bill were to pass, talk about that as a quote unquote threat from Facebook, right? But if you were to let's say you required movie producers to pay Coca-Cola every time someone was drinking a soda in the movies, what behavior would you see from movie producers? They'd cut soda out of all their movies, right? It's just a financial decision that makes sense for the business's bottom line if you're going to force these additional payments on top of what a platform's already doing, which is driving traffic to these external websites. So for Facebook, it makes sense as a business decision because news actually isn't a core component of how they necessarily draw users or make money from their platform. It is something that users enjoy, and I think a tool that a lot of consumers would be sad to see go. But for Facebook, the trade-off is to pay giant media outlets and local media outlets for all of the links shared on their platform, or reduce that content as a share of what we're sharing online and posting online, and focus more on these personal posts that actually possibly are better for creating a positive, healthy online community on Facebook, right?
Yeah, it's very interesting. Before we started talking, I looked at the bill analysis and looked at the kind of the support and opposition on the bill, and you see, very, the big papers obviously in support, and then you see, a lot of, interest groups, and in one of them, Cal Matters, opposed to the bill. So it's an interesting split on this, and kind of delving into this issue, kind of see why.
Yeah. We've raised a couple other concerns with the legislation. We have talked about an arbitration provision that we'd really like to see changed. Currently, under the legislation, the online platforms are required to go into arbitration with media outlets to determine what these payments will look like. But the arbitrations are only one way. The only thing that platforms and media outlets can consider in these negotiations is how much of the media outlet's content is shared on social media platforms. What is ruled out under the legislation is the ability for these arbitrations to take into account the traffic that social media platforms are driving to news outlets. Right. So usually when you think of arbitration, it's a two-way conversation to mediate a conflict. Right. But under this legislation, it's basically a one-way pass for media outlets to receive, again, this funding from online platforms without any consideration for the revenue that online platforms are actually generating for these news outlets.
It's interesting. I guess, traditional media, the model was you would raise money by advertisements, I guess classified ads and subscriptions. And now it seems like the whole revenue model is mainly based on advertisements. We hear a lot about, people on YouTube or different platforms, independent, making a lot of money that used to work for traditional media outlets, and they're mainly getting paid by advertisements on their YouTube channel. How what is the future of media making money, and why are they having such a struggle kind of adapting and kind of going to this kind of freemium advertisement only model?
Sure. I see the future of a lot of media outlets being subscription based. And I think that's where a lot of news outlets, as you noted, have moved to over the past decade. I think that if California legislators really want to look at how can we support local news outlets, one of the best things you could possibly be doing right now would be to offer something like a tax rebate for a news subscription to a California outlet, right? Those kind of direct incentives that would support local news, I think, would be incredibly beneficial at a time like this. I think the other reason that news outlets are struggling right now is not because of one giant internet platform or another, but because people have just fundamentally changed how they consume news. The news that my parents consume is dramatically different than the news that I consume, right? My parents watch the nightly local television station every evening at
Right.
6 p.m. and for 20 minutes, and they watch all those ads in between the newscasts. I couldn't do that. Gosh, I would never want to put myself through that every night. They turn it on every morning too, but that's not how I consume news. I listen to podcasts, right? I go on to the New York Times. Again, I have these online subscriptions. I think there has been a dramatic shift in the type of news and the type of outlet that the younger generations are interested in turning to and reading from.
Yeah, it's interesting. I guess there's a great consolidation. We see it here up at the Capitol. There used to be, maybe 100 reporters covering the Capitol. Now there's 10 from the various media outlets up here. So it's very interesting because it's creating this, I guess, consolidation, and less voices are being heard and less information is being shared, and that's kind of the scary part. Is there any talk or thought of the government subsidizing some of these papers to for the public good to get the news out?
I think we'd love to see that. Again, I see supporting journalism as a really an important pursuit for lawmakers in this digital era because journalism is struggling. There's no debate about that at all. But how you support it is important. And I think the best way to encourage local journalism and make sure more local papers don't close, because they are closing. We're actually seeing a lot of news deserts
Right.
growing across the country. The best way to support those local papers is to make sure they get pretty direct subsidies, right? Rather than making them receive money through Facebook, making them go through an online outlet to get their, 2 cents. What you want to do is, again, something like subsidizing subscriptions for local news. If California were to say, if you buy into a local news subscription, here's the tax benefit you receive, it would increase local subscriptions. People might turn more to their local paper for news rather than reading an online blog, or even turning to Fox News. That's the real benefit, is if you can encourage people to turn to local news first over these national outlets that are really taking the lion's share of viewership and readership.
Yeah, and I guess that's a valid point. Is people are being, I guess, chased away. Their eyes are going elsewhere, and to these major outlets, national outlets that aren't necessarily sharing the news from our section of the country. So
Yeah. And what's surprising to us is that we look at the set of policymakers in California, the lawmakers in the Assembly and the Senate, and this is a Democratic group that I think really would feel the same way if we sat down and had this conversation, right? Which brings us back to why our organization is really working hard to talk about the nuances of this bill rather than just the big picture. Because again, the
Right.
big picture, I think we all agree, local journalism needs help. But what are the impacts? What kind of behavior are you incentivizing from media outlets and from social media platforms and consumers? And what are consumers going to see at the end of the day? Are they going to like it?
So, kind of, what's your opinion? What's the path forward for kind of AB 886, and kind of what are you guys asking for?
Sure. Well, we'd love to see some amendments to the bill. Number one, again, we'd really like to see some of these national disinformation giants carved out of the bill. We actually launched a petition last week. We've gathered a few thousand petitions from Californians so far that have gone directly to their state senator, urging them to carve these national disinformation giants out of receiving funding under the CJPA. Specifically, we'd love to see Fox News excluded from this, given their massive disinformation settlement recently over spreading disinformation about the election. Doing that could follow a number of paths. Again, one thing you could do would be to create a cap on the size of a news organization that can receive funding under this legislation. That could exclude Fox News. You could create a requirement that the media outlets under this legislation eligible for funding have to be California based. That would also exclude Fox News. It would exclude outlets like Newsmax and a lot of these national disinformation giants that are leaking toxic content online. Right. And then finally, we've thought you could set up some sort of, you could require a California agency to look at what sort of news content is eligible. Are there fact checks going on? Right? Is this fact-based journalism, or is this more outrage content? Right? And that's actually something that the national legislation does before it makes a media outlet eligible for funding under the bill. It requires that media outlet publish a certain amount of articles that are fact-checked and that they employ fact-checkers on their staff, right? Just to make sure that this is the kind of hard-hitting sort of journalism that we want to promote, not that outrage content that we see online.
Right.
So we'd love to see that amendment. We think that would make the bill better. Again, there are other concerns as well, such as the arbitration model. But
and what specifically with the arbitration model are you guys concerned with?
We're concerned that, again, classically under California and national law, an arbitration is a two-way conversation where both parties can bring something to the table, can bring their arguments to the table. What we see in this legislation is that online platforms are stripped of the ability of discussing how the traffic they send to local media outlets impacts those media outlets and basically the revenue that they generate for media outlets by sending traffic their way. We think that could be fixed as well.
Okay, interesting. Well, Chris, thank you so much. This was a very interesting deep dive in kind of this issue, and definitely uh, raised a lot of questions in my mind. So thank you so much, and I hope our listeners enjoy it. And definitely would love to have you on a little more to talk a lot more about technology and especially
Yeah.
AI.
I was about to say, next time I'm on, let's talk about artificial intelligence. Yeah. Uh,
Definitely the new frontier.
Thank you for having me on, Jared. I appreciate
All
it.
right, thanks, Chris.